It's early morning at the Abbey and the cleaners are in. But these are not your regular cleaners, as they've all been trained to work with the Abbey's precious artifacts, including the most important chair in the country, which is kept off limits in a secure chapel.
At the moment, I'm dusting the Coronation chair. It's the oldest piece of furniture still in use for its original purpose in Europe.
Across 7 centuries, 26 monarchs have been crowned on it. Henry VIII, Queen Victoria, and Queen Elizabeth II, they have all sat here.
We use goat hair brushes that are very, very soft, and we just lightly flick the dust off of the surface and into the vacuum. And we do that about every 6 months.
It's clearly not your simple spit and polish kind of a job, which is why the chair is reserved for expert conservator Krista.
I've trained for several years to become an expert in painted and gilded paintings and objects. So you have to have a real knowledge of the object so that you don't damage it while you're taking care of it.
And no one wants that, although the Abbey didn't always look after the chair quite so well.
I'm now cleaning the seat, which is covered with 18th and 19th century graffiti from visitors and Westminster schoolboys. So there's P. Abbott, slept in the chair, 5th, 6th of July, 1800.
Because of the pandemic, this is the first time the Dean and Krista have met.
So tell me about cleaning the chair. How difficult is it?
So it's inherently very fragile and is very prone to flaking. So we have to be very careful when we remove the dust that there aren't any loose flakes of gilding.
Fragile throughout, or are there particular bits of it?
All of it's quite fragile. It's a historic artifact, but obviously it's a working abbey, so it's not in a display case.
And the graffiti is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, the damage they did, and I mean, the fact that they could just wander around the Abbey, it's amazing.
Yes. Luckily, they don't do that anymore.
No, they don't. It's colleagues here who just know so much. It's looking around the Abbey, you keep finding something new, and then meeting a colleague, and the place just opens up. It's fantastic. This is where a king or a queen binds himself, herself to the nation. This is the place where we say it is really important that we are one people in one place. It's the vocation of the Abbey.